Jesus said, "Y'all are the salt of the earth." He did not say you, on your own, need to try hard to be the salt of the earth. He said to his disciples, to the rest of the crowd that had gathered on the hillside to hear him, and to us as we listen to him today, y'all together are the salt of the earth. In the 1920s, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company published a little booklet, 101 Uses for Diamond Crystal Salt. This list of uses included keeping the colors bright on boiled vegetables, making ice cream freeze, getting more heat out of your boiled water, removing rust, stiffening white organdy. I know y'all use salt for that all the time. Putting out grease fires, killing poison ivy, treating sore throats and earaches. Of course, there are more than 101 uses for salts. The modern salt industry, in fact, says there are approximately 14,000 uses for salt. So when Jesus says to us, y'all are the salt of the earth, does he mean I'm going to throw you on the roads to melt the ice so that the cars can travel? Or you make ice cream possible? Does he mean you tend to raise people's blood pressure? That's what one woman suggested at Women's Bible Study this week. What does it mean to be the salt of the earth? Well, salt raises my blood pressure. And I said, yeah, Christians can tend to do that. Let's imagine what those people gathered on the hillside might have thought Jesus meant. And as we think about that, I hope you will consider too how each of these meanings might speak to you. So Simon and Andrew, James and John were there, Jesus' disciples, who just a few weeks ago he called to and said, "Let me make you fishers of men." And so they left their nets and followed Jesus. I imagine these former fishermen had one specific response to hearing Jesus say they were salt. They had left a livelihood that relied on salt. Salt to cure and preserve the fish that they caught. That's what kept it from spoiling so that they could then sell it. So they heard salt and thought about smelly fish. They heard salt and thought, okay, if I'm salt, I preserve life. I keep things from stinking. I make sure the hungry can get fed. Some of the other disciples present that day used to be tax collectors before they followed Jesus. They probably heard salt and thought immediately of money, about the fact that salted fish were at the heart of Roman commerce and empire building. I mean, as Rome expanded, one of the main things they did in each new place was to build a salt works. That was one of their strategies for expanding. And you know, it was common in Rome at this time to say that the emperor and the Roman Empire were the light of the world. So when Jesus says, "You are the light of the world," he's making a political statement. He's saying, actually, no, Roman Empire, you are not the light of the world. These people gathered on the hillside, these fishermen and tax collectors, these sick, these hungry, they're the light of the world. And so similarly, when Jesus says you're the salt of the earth, maybe he's saying something political about the earth doesn't actually revolve around economic production, commerce, but around people. And then this larger crowd. We had the disciples, but there's also a larger crowd that has followed Jesus and listened with rapt attention as he said, "Blessed are the poor and the merciful and the hungry." These people are now cocking their heads with curiosity as he says, "You are the salt and you are the light." Some of this larger crowd perhaps were off-duty Roman soldiers. They heard salt and also thought about money. They thought about salary. That's sometimes how soldiers got paid. in salt. That's where our expression, he's worth his salt, comes from. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. Or they might have thought about this expression in Latin that said a man in love was salted. If you were in love, you were a salted man. That's where we get the word salacious. They might have heard that they were the salt of the earth and thought, does that mean I'm valuable? Or perhaps there were some religious people in the crowd, people who knew that salt was part of the sacrificial rites in the temple, part of the covenant that God had made. They knew that Leviticus said to season your grain offerings to God with salt. They knew that Numbers talked about an everlasting covenant of salt. These people might have heard salt and thought of God's promises. They might have thought, if I'm salt, then I'm part of a pleasing offering to God. I'm a sign that God will keep God's promises. Surely there were mothers in this crowd. And maybe those mothers knew this practice mentioned in the book of Ezekiel of rubbing newborn infants with salt to protect them from evil. This was actually a pretty widespread practice that predated Christianity and continued through the Middle Ages across Europe. Some people would put salt on a newborn's tongue to protect it from evil. Some would dunk them in salt water. Some would just put a little salt in the cradle with them. These mothers might have heard, you are salt, and thought, if I'm salt, I have the power to protect others. And so how about us? We too are part of this crowd that Jesus is addressing, and we might think of many of these same things. After all, we still throw a pinch of salt over your shoulder to ward off bad luck, right? We gargle with salt water to soothe a sore throat. Well, I don't, that's disgusting. But my mom always tries to get me to do that. We use salt scrubs in the shower to get clean. We sprinkle flaky sea salt on our chocolate chip cookies to make them a little more delicious. Y'all are the salt of the earth, Jesus says. You are valuable. You are lovable. You bring healing. You preserve life. You are a sign of the covenant God has made with all creation. Y'all are a sign of the covenant God has made with all creation. I'm saying y'all here because in the Greek, it's a plural you. And we don't distinguish that in English, the singular and the plural you. But if you ever want to know, you can go to y'allversion.com. You can. My childhood next door neighbor friend John created a website, y'allversion.com, where you can go and it will translate every plural you as y'all. This is the best way to read the Bible, y'all. If you know your Appalachian history, you might know something about what salt has meant to this region in particular. Because actually the first thing we started extracting from the ground in these mountains was salt. Salt sparked the first extractive industry in the southern Appalachians. The processing of that salt is what led us to the harvesting of timber and then the excavation of coal to keep those evaporative furnaces burning. So you are the salt of the earth here in Appalachia might also mean that you're connected to some complicated economic systems. There's life, and there's also some exploitation. But salt kept us alive in the Appalachians. Our whole southern foodways in the Appalachians is dependent on salt. In those long, dark winters of places in the Appalachians that were named things like Poor Fork, Raw Dough, Need More, Long Hungry. These were some mountain villages. In those places, salt allowed us to pickle and preserve and cure so that the meat and vegetables we did have would last through the winter. It was a struggle to grow and preserve enough food for everyone. Salt made it possible. Salt can make a little into enough to feed everyone. You, salt, can make a little into enough to feed everyone. Not, of course, if we stay in our salt shakers in the cupboard. Not if you live cloistered away. And not if you're eaten by the spoonful. Oh, can you feel that? Oh, I can't even think about it. But taken out and mixed with other things, you're at your best. And you are bringing out the best in others. And perhaps this is part of what Isaiah is trying to show us when Isaiah says, yeah, you say that you love me and you're in church every Sunday, but you're not feeding the hungry. You're not out there fighting injustice. You're not out there thinking about oppression. Being salt means you are engaging with the rest of the world. Salt at its best is out there, mixing, working for justice and against oppression, bringing the homeless into our homes, Isaiah says, not hiding from our kin. We are embodying the new kingdom that God is establishing. We are brought into it by Christ's incarnation. And the kind of community for which the world hungers finds a new existence in us. Y'all are the salt of the earth. It means a million things, and that's one of the things I love about the Bible is that these words are endlessly meaningful. We can turn them and always find something new. But today, of all these million meanings, the one I'm holding closest is this. The right amount of salt makes food delicious, right? Salt is necessary for health and life, but it's not just necessary, it also brings joy and pleasure. The joy of a perfectly seasoned bite of food, the difference between a bite of boiled potato and a bite of salted boiled potato, that's what Jesus says we are. Perhaps what Jesus is saying when he says, y'all are the salt of the earth, is you fill Jesus with delight. Amen.